Hey, everybody, welcome to our USA Wrestling National Coaches Council Heads Up podcast. I'm joined with my co-host, Mike Haggerty, and our special panel today it represents both the NAIA and the NCWWC, which are our NCAA member schools. So from the NAIA side, we've got Paul Rademacher, and from the NCWWC, we've got Cliff Cushard. Cushard, thank you. I knew I'd get something wrong before we got too far into this. We've also got one of the scientific founders of this new weight management program, Dr. Andrew Jagim. He's with the Mayo Clinic, and Dr. Jackie Paquette from the National Wrestling Coaches Association. Whew, how was that? Was that okay?
Good, got it all.
Very cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. When Coach Haggerty and I heard about this, the first thing we were saying is like, we've got to learn more so that we can share more. So just super excited to hear. And maybe a great first question is, why in the heck did we need to go from a 12% body fat recommendation to a 17% body fat? What was the problem that initially came up, and where did that problem, how was it communicated? How was it initiated to be able to start the research and to get behind this?
Jackie, I don't know if you want to kind of
Sure,
start on
I
that,
can.
because I think your group somewhat initiated a lot of the early conversations, and then I think kind of brought other players into the mix.
Sure. So just from hearing from the coaches and understanding that the 12% was based on a study that was done decades ago, and was done on prepubescent gymnasts. So not wrestlers necessarily. And obviously we understand that the women's side of our sport is newer, especially in respect to length of research. And the time that we've had to research. So in knowing that, and in knowing that we had the data that we do in the OPC, we thought it pertinent to get something started, and at the encouragement of our coaches, thought it pertinent that we get something started. And so working with Dr. Jagim and his group, we're able to get him some OPC data from the entire country for an entire season, and able to start that process and begin to look at what is actually representative of our women's wrestling population and what is a healthy number then for our actual women's wrestling population.
It's exciting to hear that the science and that the research and that the data being collected is being used in a beneficial, healthy way for our athletes. It makes me just excited about our sport even more, if that's possible.
Yeah, and it was kind of unique from the scientific side of it to be a part of this conversation and initiative so quickly, with a new sport kind of being not necessarily new in that regard, but just kind of the changes and recent evolutions to it. Usually changes and research questions like that, and then the implementation of findings sometimes take a decade plus before I can see a study get published and before it kind of trickles down to actually make a meaningful impact on a sport. So to see it kind of sped up through this process, and to see a lot of the questions and the pursuit of better answers coming from the sport and the coaches, I think it was just such a unique opportunity for me to get involved with. And so again, it's just, as we were saying earlier, it's unique to see it kind of brought so quickly to the table, and to see coaches pushing for the change, and to see things really get implemented on a much quicker timeline than we normally see.
Wow. And Cliff and Paul, you'd mentioned that this was an important leadership group discussion between both organizations, and not much negative feedback. Even after the policy has now been adopted, there really hasn't been a lot of pushback or negativity. That was really cool to hear.
Yeah, it was. And I'll just back up a little bit from what Dr. Jagim just said. It actually took us 10 years to get to this point. He just wasn't involved for the whole 10 years.
Well, there you go.
But we started this conversation roughly 10 years ago about, when we were getting our OPC data on our wrestlers, because it gives us our weight descent plans laid out and our minimum weights. And we were seeing situations where we had, say, a 170-pound lady who's in great physical shape being told that she could get down to 120 pounds if she just did the right things to lose weight. And that's where we started to look at the percentages and say, there's something wrong here built into the system. And that led to the conversations of, what is wrong. And then we did just some really quick research on the percentages. 12% for a college age woman is considered anorexic by most standards. So, we're encouraging our athletes to become anorexic, I guess, is one way to consider it. And I don't think any coach is intentionally pushing for that type of thing, but what I personally was concerned with was that a well-intentioned coach would be, hey, you're 170 pounds right now, but it says you can get down to 120. Can you imagine how great a wrestler you'd be at 120 pounds? And it was those well-intentioned but not well-informed coaches that drove me personally to want this change so that we could protect everybody equally.
I think on the NAI side, it was the same, like coaches just knowing that it was a matter of that's not a realistic number for most athletes. And we need to find something that's safer so that we don't give opportunity for bad things to happen, like has happened to the men's division years ago. So.
For sure.
Yeah, and maybe just kind of even going back to the initial question of, what is the problem and why do we need to kind of address this? Just speaking more on the physiology side of things, when you open that door for a female athlete to cut down in terms of their body fat percent, getting into the low teens, that's where we start to see a lot of problems arise in terms of more of the health side of things. So people usually have heard of terms like the female athlete triad. Nowadays, we've kind of added an additional condition or syndrome referred to as the relative energy deficiency in sport, which is somewhat similar in nature. And both of them kind of address this issue where an athlete, male or female, but obviously in this case, a little bit more specific to the female side of it, if they get too low in weight or too lean in terms of body fat percent, it can cause different disruptions to their normal hormonal patterns, which can cause issues with menstrual cycle function, which can then impact a variety of different other kind of health systems, and then obviously overall performance implications as well. So it certainly puts them at risk for more injuries, again, disruptions to the menstrual cycle, which can also then impact bone health and some of those other systems, just leaving that door open for a lot of bad things to happen from kind of a health perspective. And then again, if you're weaker, losing weight, suffering from irregular menstrual cycle, it could then start to negatively impact their performance, which obviously is a concern from the coaching and competitive side of it. But then if we look at the long-term implications of it, that's where I think a lot of big concerns were really stemming from, is we don't want to open the door for these young female athletes to do something that could negatively impact their health for the next 20, 30 years. Maybe when they're done playing, they want to start a family, or, they're now all of a sudden diagnosed with early onset osteoporosis in their 30s or 40s, all because of stuff that they did as a high school or young, collegiate female athlete, where if they would have been, better educated and again, across the whole sport, just more education and information about this to kind of deter some of those problematic behaviors and get ahead of the issue, which is kind of what we've done here now, I think just helps deter some of those problematic behaviors and hopefully just leading to an overall improved kind of health status for that female wrestler.
I was just curious, Jackie, you mentioned that you basically handed off the data from the OPC, and then Dr. Jagim, you worked through this data. Can you help us or understand a little bit more of the actual process and what data you're actually looking at and how this was formulated?
Yep. So the kind of exported data that we got had a summary of their skin fold values. So when they go through the pinch testing and, that kind of gets inputted into the system. So we had each of the skin fold values. We had their current weight at the time of weight certification. And then we had kind of the computed body fat percent. So when they enter all that in, it calculates what their estimated body fat percent is. And then depending on the level of competition, whether it's, collegiate or high school on the men's side of it, or again, on the female side of it, it's using that 12% body fat percent threshold. So it takes that and then extrapolates out what their minimal wrestling weight would be, and then kind of sets the floor for that minimal weight class. So that was all the information that we kind of were given through that database. And so some of the things we did was just to calculate some kind of common descriptives that we see in research. So what was the average body fat percent, standard deviations, what were the average values across different weight classes, so we could kind of look at those different trends. But one of the things that we did to try to help determine what an alternative threshold should be is we created some percentile values, so we could essentially determine that 95% of the collegiate female wrestlers were above a certain threshold for body fat percent. And we found that to be, we found 17% to kind of be that value that represented that 95% majority. So only about 5% of all of the collegiate female wrestlers would be below that threshold. So when we look to making this change, we can say that it's really going to impact that small percentage there. And again, kind of across the entire sport, representative of the most previous season, we could say that, again, this would probably improve the overall health of kind of the sport as a whole, and then really going to only impact a small percentages there. And so we kind of factored that information. And then also Craig Horswell, which was a part of our group, he kind of did a unique analysis where he took all the published literature on female wrestlers and also kind of combined them into a pooled database, and pretty much came up with the same answer of 90% or plus percent of kind of the published literature suggests that really not a lot of them are even below this body fat percent anyway. And so we kind of took both of that into consideration, saying, if we make this switch, it's not impacting a lot of them. And I think everyone would agree from like a sports medicine standpoint that that's a probably more appropriate value to prevent some of those negative health effects that would come from getting too lean in terms of just too low of a body fat percent. So it was kind of a combination of those different inputs that that led us down to that decision.
Did you have any hypothesis going into this? Did you assume that there was going to be a big jump in that number from 12 to 17, or what actually, when you were looking at the data prior to and even during, did you see some things that stood out to you in that regard?
Yeah, I would say that the thing that surprised me the most was that the average body fat percent was about 24% for the entire group across the entire sport. And that's excluding the heavyweights. So we took them out just because that obviously can kind of throw off some of our mean values a bit when we have the really heavier competitors. So even after excluding them, the mean value was still 24%. So that was a lot higher than I was anticipating. And so when we identified that threshold and found that, 17% was kind of where we saw that split, again, I was kind of thankful, because then it made it easier, I think, for people to accept raising up to that value, where if we were to say, only half of the wrestlers are at a certain range, then it would be a lot harder to convince people that we would need to go up. But really, we don't really see that. And again, only a small percentage are probably walking around in the low teens in terms of like a lower body fat percent around that 12% value. And if I were to guess, that's probably really only reserved for more of the elite programs, or really the lightweights that just walking around are naturally kind of closer to that 12% body fat that just doesn't appear to be that common across the entire sport.
So even at those lighter weights, it didn't seem like the body fat percentages were as drastically low as maybe we had thought that they would have been.
Yep. Yeah. And similarly on the men's side, like across the board, they really aren't extremely low that I think some people may suspect they are. Obviously, there's cases where they are and they don't really have a lot of weight to lose. So there's certainly those out there, but just not nearly as common as I guess I would have suspected kind of going into it.
Joan Fulp from our USA Wrestling Executive Board and Girls High School Developmental Committee had recommended a book to me. It was Lauren Fleshman, Good for a Girl. And I don't know if I didn't send this out in advance to set everybody up, but in the book, what a powerful story about her struggles with coaches telling her, you need to lose 5 pounds to be a better runner. If you want to run at these times at this level, it was such pressure put on these female athletes, in addition to all the other pressures that are going on in their lives. And with the number at a mean, an average of about 24%, is this something that we see may go higher over time as we get more scientific information? Do we see that maybe the 17 could go to 20? Is that a healthier range, or is 17 considered, hey, this is the baseline for health, and we're right now, at least, we're pretty happy with that number?
The way I would answer that is I'm comfortable with the 17%, kind of looking at it from a health side of it. I think that's okay to set the floor at that value. Again, knowing that not all of them even get to their minimum weight or minimum weight class anyway. So I think that's okay to establish that low end. And then actually what I think will happen if we just flash forward to the next 10 years, if I were to repeat this analysis with an OPC database, I think we'll see the average body fat percents actually get a bit lower with time as more competitors come into the sport. I think it just pushes the expectations and the competitiveness higher. And so sometimes that may encourage people to get as close to their minimum weight as they can or be a bit more lean, especially at the high school level where they don't necessarily have to fight for a roster spot and, and fit in there to fill a specific weight class. They have a little bit more freedom to wrestle wherever they kind of want to, at least around our kind of area, the high school programs that I work with. So I think as the sport grows, I think that may drive down the average body fat percents, but it's hard to know definitively what will happen. I don't know if the coaches would kind of agree with that type of trend moving forward or not.
I guess this would be a question maybe for everyone on the call. Are we comfortable across the board with the actual testing mechanisms? Are we comfortable with the skin fold? I mean, you received, AJ, you received the data that has been utilized in the testing processes as they were outlined prior to any discussion about this. Is there a better way? Is there a more efficient way? More, I don't know, how do you say it ethically, I guess, with what we're doing currently with skin fold, et cetera. What are your all's thoughts across the board with where we're at right now? And we're getting the right data. I mean, the data is what it is, but it's coming from a source of skin fold testing, hydration testing, et cetera, that sometimes has been in question over the years with the guys in particular, and of course now entering in the new world with women. So I was just curious what the group thought of where we're at right now. Are we in a good space, or do we need to continually look at the mechanisms of testing?
Mike, we have brought that up. Both divisions, the NAI and NCAA leadership groups have brought that up. That is one of the things we're trying to get looked at. Is this 2-site skin fold for females a valid testing site, testing results? What we saw originally was that it was, what they had in. And so we know that the data is consistent, whether or not it's the most accurate or not, it is consistent. And so then we have started the process of trying to get Dr. Jagim some more data. We have bod pods at my school. Cliff has access to various things. Some other schools have various different industry standard techniques that they can test the skin fold and test the other methods and then get that data back. And that's just being started is kind of the process is where we would be at with that, I think. And then back to Dr. Jagim's question there, I would say as a coach, I am comfortable with the 17. I think the way it was looked at, the way it was dealt with, the way we looked at it from both a wrestling aspect, but also, and Dr. Jagim looked at it from an outside of wrestling aspect as well with his team of elite athletes. This is the safe number. And so then when we say, hey, wrestling is lean athletes, we know that as long as we're still using an elite athlete number, that's going to help us. I think the OPC data is something that, because we do it at the beginning of the season, that kind of also skews it a little bit higher than it would initially look like as they get to weight and get to their weight classes. But it saves us the coaches saying, hey, you can get there. I know you can be tough, whatever they might say. And I really think that that's the safeguard that it gave us. Is it's just healthier for the female athlete. And in the end, we want that, like whether we want to win or not, in the end, we want them healthy and 20 years from now being able to live their life however they chose to live it.
And then kind of tacking onto that a little bit, a phrase that I like to use is just optimal performance doesn't come at minimal weight. It's finding that right weight for that athlete and her wrestling style and her goals and all those things. These are student athletes. They're college students first, right? They're not able to work on their weight and nutrition 24 hours a day like an elite level athlete does. Finding that healthy spot where we can be optimal is what we're shooting for.
That's a great point, Cliff. The fact that these are student athletes, they're still going to classes every day. They still have, so many different demands upon their time, that wrestling is a part of that experience. And while it can be a big part, and for certain athletes, certainly it is bigger. What are we seeing right now in the college setting? Because I know the influx of girls at the high school level looking for college programs. There's so much beautiful growth around our sport through women's wrestling. I don't even know what the question is. There's so many questions bouncing around in my head. But I guess the participation versus high performance tracks, because right now there's probably a lot of girls who are, hey, I only wrestled for a year in high school, or I didn't wrestle in high school, but now I'm wrestling at the college level, and that still exists, although less and less each year. What are you, as coaches, as the National Wrestling Coach Association rep, and Dr. Jagim, what are we seeing as far as that high performance track versus the participation track? Because if I'm a participation athlete, I don't need to probably be at that minimum optimal weight. Whereas if I am on a high performance track, that's maybe a little bit more important. What are you noticing?
I think it's a wide variety between teams. I have one of the bigger rosters in the country, and so we have a wide variety of athletes that want to be part of something that they think will be great and get their degree and do those things. And we've got a bunch of athletes that have goals of trying to make national and world teams, and everything in between exists on our team. And we just want to be able to provide that for all of them. We want to be able to provide that experience of being a great teammate and being a great part of what we're accomplishing, as well as provide a training environment that they can compete at the highest level. And that's what we see. And I say that through our recruiting class for next year, as well as what we have on our team currently.
And I think too, as the sport grows, I also hope it comes with additional resources allocated to it. Like, I think that would also be a differentiator between participation kind of level sport involvement versus the elite side of it, where you have a sport dietitian available to guide them through the nutritional modifications to help them safely cut weight if they need to, manage the rapid weight loss if that's a need, again, the few days before a competition, and then on the backside of it, helping them, recover more optimally and so forth, and just kind of managing that throughout the season. And then coupled with more sport specific strength conditioning practices as well. How can you optimize kind of relative strength for these athletes and not kind of add more fuel to the fire with inappropriate strength conditioning practices that just may not be applicable to the sport, or they're taking a football program and saying, oh, it's close enough, let's just use it for the wrestling program. And so I just hope those resources and kind of more sport specific strategies tend to come with this rapid growth in the sport, because I think that'll just help these female competitors, as well as bringing in that, again, kind of sport expertise to just help support them and guide them with things outside of the mat that will definitely play a big role in their long-term success and health of the athlete as well.
Cliff, you and AJ both commented on this. I'm sorry, I was going to ask a specific question in regards, when you mentioned, you both in sort of bounced on this a little bit in regards to optimal performance. I loved your analogy too, Cliff. That was awesome. But my question being, through the data, is there a way to determine what that optimum number actually was with performance? Was that in there somewhere, or could you extract any of that? Like, here are our highest performing athletes. Here's where their body fats or their body compositions were at that particular time. Is the information available for that, or was that anything that was even intended to be looked at?
That stuff I always bug Jackie with when she sends me these. I'm like, any other info I can get here? But
So everything we sent, Andrew, was de-identified.
Yeah.
So there's no way. So he was sent a data set of it's almost 1,700 wrestlers is what you ended up with the data totally from NAIA and NCAA. completely de-identified though, no team identifiers, things of that nature. So we couldn't tell you, for this season, it was 2022, 23. So we couldn't tell you who were the student athletes on King and North Central versus who were on the student athletes on the brand new programs for that year.
But Jackie, the data did have information related to what that athlete went to as far as what weight class. Is that accurate?
Yes, it
So
did. It did give. Yes, it did. It did include the lowest weight that wrestler recorded for the year as well. Yes.
De-identified, so we didn't know if it was a national qualifier or not, but we knew that athlete got to their lowest OPC number or not, Mike. So there was some data in there related to that.
I gotcha. So there was some clarity with regard to the number of athletes that went to the lowest possible weight class.
Yep.
Yes.
And not a lot of them do. Not as many as I would have suspected. Well, I guess that's to say using the 12%. We'll see now moving forward if that's different for the next season, if more of them kind of get closer to that minimum weight. But going back to your question, we almost need that analysis done at the team level, and in each kind of team and program, maybe just over time keep tabs on, okay, here's our body fat percent across our different competitors, across the different weight classes. Is there a trend where those that stay at a healthier body fat tend to have a better record at the end of the season, or go further in, postseason competition or national qualifiers, which it just would take some organization to kind of get, different teams to contribute to that. But I think that would kind of help answer that question of, is there a weight or a body fat that does tend to be that sweet spot for optimal performance, where they're healthier, they've maintained their strength and power better, they're still quick on the mat and can still do things that they need to for success in that regard. But putting all that together, like, what does that look like for kind of the optimal body fat of an athlete in terms of predicting longer term success?
If we flipped it a little bit, and not to get into the weeds too far with this, but we're looking at body fat versus muscle mass in our testing. And even with like DEXA, there's some room for error with testing, even with DEXAs and stuff. My question is, do we ever consider looking at muscle mass versus body fat in regards to optimum weight?
You're kind of looking at both with body fat percent. It's kind of built into that percentage or ratio to some degree, but what I've actually used in other areas of research is looking at what's called fat-free mass index.
Exactly.
And so if you've heard of body mass index, it's essentially the same kind of ratio, except you're looking at fat-free mass, which is a large percentage of lean body mass or muscle mass. And so I think that metric could also be built into some of this type of work, and seeing, like, is there an optimal fat-free mass index, or the amount of muscle that an athlete should strive to carry on their frame, where, again, it tends to better correlate with strength and power and muscular endurance and some of those physical attributes that would be very beneficial to a wrestler. And so I think you could kind of look at it from that perspective as well, to see where is that value at. And I would suspect that's probably somewhere around 20 in terms of like a fat-free mass index that would be ideal for a lot of these wrestlers to strive for. The hard part is you still got to make weight and fit into a weight class at the end of the day. And so you only have so much wiggle room sometimes in terms of going up or down or staying at your weight class, and how that would play out with where your fat-free mass value looks like, or what your body fat percent kind of allows you to do.
I've just always been curious. I mean, we look at the body fat as sort of like our guiding light of making weight, etc., as opposed to, and I know it's difficult to actually measure muscle mass when you've got bone densities and other issues and non-muscle components in the test itself, but I would love to know what those numbers are. Like, if you're looking at really trying to figure out what is the best combination of not only body fat, but muscle mass, et cetera, fat-free, and so on. And I know it's hard to extract that with just the body fat itself. You can get close, obviously, but yeah.
And that comes up in a lot with conversations with the men's team that I work with, especially the 125 and 133 guys, when they're trying to make weight and get down, to get certified for their weight class, that comes up sometimes is where they may have to lose muscle to
Yeah.
get their weight down to a low enough amount that would allow them to wrestle at 125. And I always say, like, by doing that, you're giving up some strength and power. So it's like, what's best in that situation? Do you want to just wrestle because you got to fill that roster spot, or do you want to be at your strongest and most powerful? Because if that's the goal, you may have to go up a weight class. But obviously, as you guys all know, there's more to that conversation sometimes than what's best for the individual, because they're still a part of a team. So just a lot of moving parts sometimes. But I tell them you never really want to give up muscle if you can avoid it, because you're kind of sacrificing performance to some degree when you do that.
Not only sacrificing muscle mass, but sacrificing energy
Mhm.
output, right? So yeah.
Jackie,
Very good.
how big of an impact does the National Wrestling Coaches Association Leadership Academy have on this educational process, helping coaches to identify what metrics to look at? Like, hey, I'm not just trying to get you to a weight class because I need to fill the weight class. Like, a lot of times when we're working with coaches, if we don't talk to them about being intentional in various areas, it's easy, right? I've done it as a coach myself. It's very easy to say, well, this is better for the team, so this is what has to happen. How big of an opportunity has that Leadership Academy been in terms of creating discussions and safe places for coaches to learn and share their thoughts and to grow? And Cliff and Paul.
We're thankful to have Cliff and Paul both on the call, because they're both mentors in the Leadership Academy and have been a part of those discussions at large. But that's the point of the Leadership Academy, is to create discussion amongst those young coaches with their more seasoned veterans, right? Sitting there at the table with them, able to answer these questions and have those discussions. That's the whole point of the discussion-based setting that the Leadership Academy is. Correct, gentlemen?
Yeah, a lot of the best conversations are the ones where we're just sitting around in the lobby having those, or at a meal having those conversations. Yes.
And I think too, just the building of relationship, so that like the mentees I've had the past couple of years, especially the ones that are already at programs, they still call me, hey, what do I need to do in this situation? Whether it's to, a lot of times it's simpler. It's, hey, this track wrestling question or this whatever, but like they have questions. They know they can come to me about any of those type of hard situations too. And I think that's one of the things that it does the best.
Awesome. What are we missing? What are we missing that we haven't had a chance to really talk about in this discussion? Because we're talking about health, we're talking about coaching education, we're talking about scientific evidence-based data. Is there anything that is important for our guests to hear as they're moving forward? Not just coaches.
I do think so, Mike. In the process of, obviously, people kicked back more. People probably kicked back more about the weight classes than they did the body fat percentage. And so I think it's important to make sure that people know that it wasn't just random. We took the numbers from Dr. Jagim. We took numbers and looked at them, and looked at the body fat percentages, looked at where they would fall with the new percentages to create opportunities for competitive weight classes with a reasonable difference between them, not just, well, let's pull numbers out of thin air and hope that people can make them and whatever. Like, I think people thought that's what happened, but it really wasn't. We really did spend a lot of time looking at it to try to figure out how to keep both the lightweights available, that, the athletes that don't quite weigh 100 pounds, where they can still be competitive, as well as increase the top end so that, hey, some of the athletes that have been a little bigger, we've seen that they're bigger athletes, and we understand that they exist, and trying to give them the opportunity to compete at college as well. And everything in between had to fit in order to keep the 10 weight classes, because the organizations above us, not the NWCA, the NAI, the NCAA, says we can't have more weight classes. And so that's why numbers had to change and things had to move. And I think it's important people understand that was like, there was real thought given to that, even though maybe people don't know the thought that went into it. We polled the coaches, we talked to the coaches, we looked at the data, we came up with numbers, we came up with a second set of numbers, we came up with a third set of numbers, and worked through it to really try to figure out what the right thing for those athletes was, so that, yes, they do have to make some adjustments, but they generally, based on what I'm seeing with my team, we're in a better space as far as my team is.
We're talking about a collaborative process here too. We had the NCAA and NAIA groups working together as one on this. And that's not something you see very often. Men's, women's, wrestling, any of the other sports sponsored at the collegiate level. We had the NAIA and NCAA working together on this intentionally because we knew what an impact it was going to have. And they did a terrific job in doing that.
Yeah, and one of the worst things we could have had happen is for us to agree on different weight classes and not be able to compete against each other very effectively during the season. So we wanted to be sure not to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah, great point. Especially as we're still growing, right? To travel further distances to meet a like opponent if the weight classes were different could really stress the sport and the athletes a lot more. That's really cool.
Well, and we were seeing it at the high school level where different states had different slates of weight classes. So, you know, that was a big change, 2 years ago, I think, when the NFHSS came out with unified weight class for women wrestling in high school. That was very helpful. And I will also point out that this is the first time that I'm aware of that any weight classes have ever been established based on data and logic rather than emotion and feel. So, you know, we're kind of proud that we were able to do that first. All the other weight classes have always just been, oh, what do you think of this one? What do you think of that one? Yeah, I like this one. I don't like that one. You know, we actually were able to sit down and establish what those safe gaps were between weight classes, that the gaps should be larger at the top end rather than at the bottom end, of course, because of the relative sizes of the athletes involved. We did ask if we could have more than 10 weight classes. We didn't really get a solid we didn't get a yes, obviously. We didn't really get a solid no, though. So I think that's something for us to continue to pursue. And because obviously the way we're set up right now, I do think an extra 1 or 2 weight classes would make all the difference in the world from a competitive safety point of view.
And even with some of these conversations, it's also kind of been brought up that this may be an evolving process the next 10 years. Like we may have to revisit some of this in a couple of years just because of the rapid growth and massive influx of new girls coming into the sport at the high school level, which obviously will then probably translate up to the college level. So all these numbers could change in various directions here in the next couple of years. So we could have to do this all over again to kind of come up with the better set of numbers that are more reflective of the current wrestlers at that time.
I don't think we could. I think we should.
Yeah.
Do we as organizations, we can support the bandwidth to continue to make this a constant change and a constant evolution? We've got everybody on board with that?
Yes.
At least for the foreseeable future, I believe so.
Yeah.
Because as these ladies are filling in the high school ranks, you know, they've been self-selecting to smaller weights over the years because they've had to practice with and compete against boys in a lot of cases. And the larger ladies, that 180-pounder who's never wrestled, steps into the room for the first time in 9th grade and has to go against a boy of that size who maybe has been wrestling for 6 or 8 years. They're self-selecting out of the sport. Now that we've got girls wrestling with and competing against only other girls, it's more of an even playing field. And I personally feel that top end is going to fill in a lot more than it is today. So I think we're going to need to look at reassessing in 5 years or so. There's going to be what have we grown? 40,000 athletes in the last 5 years, something like that at the high school level. Another 40 or more thousand ladies stepping into the sport. It's going to change the data. There's no way around it. It's not going to stay the same.
Yeah. And again, even with like advanced training practices, I think we'll get bigger, stronger girls coming from that as well as they put on muscle and just kind of grow and develop into that wrestling body type. Because right now they don't really have, certainly at the high school level, they just don't have a lot of that. So their body types and physiques haven't quite evolved to the same degree as what we see on the boys' side. So that's again another reason why I think we'll revisit this because of the changing body types that are also likely coming.
And that goes back to wrestling IQ stuff, right? These ladies, if the average college wrestler is coming in with 2, 3, maybe 4 years of experience, but the average male college wrestler is coming in with 8 or 10 or 12, the ladies are going to get to 8, 10, 12 years of experience real soon here. Well, and they're at a higher level of thinking. They're at a higher level of training. You know, everything's going to be different.
Well, Mike, we know USA Wrestling's numbers for girls are like over 100% more than they've ever been. So that's the interesting piece too, is this is being supported completely from the bottom up. It's not just high school, it's youth as well.
That's such a great point too, because the National Wrestling Coaches Association really is like a top down, as opposed to USA Wrestling that starts at that younger youth level and brings it back up, which is can be such a great synergy when we're working together, which is awesome.
That was exactly my next question in that regard. Like we have the NAI represented here. We've got women's wrestling across the board represented. We have the NCAA represented. My question from this podcast being offered up through USA Wrestling, there is no mandatory testing of athletes at any level in regards to body composition, uh, dehydration issues, or whatever. What would your advice be to an organization such as USA Wrestling in regards to how we should look at these issues, knowing that we don't oftentimes work within a structure of a team other than clubs? It's a little bit different. Again, the entire platform's different. Uh, what do we need to be aware of within USA Wrestling?
I think it's a continuing education piece, like whether it's a podcast like this, but I just in general, like the things that you guys are doing with getting it out there that, hey, Penn State, the most successful team, right? They don't cut weight the same way that we used to in 1995. And the teams that, like, just the information that's out and getting that out and saying, hey, it's not what we used to think. It is about being in that optimal performance weight, not the lowest you can get and get on a scale and have somebody helps you off. I think just sharing that information and just making sure people see that, hey, we're being really, really successful at what we're doing without taking everybody to the lowest possible that they can be alive at.
And
I think
also,
that's great.
I don't know if it's a direct answer to that, but just in talking with people who work with NCAA wrestlers who also then compete internationally at more of the elite level, that's a big challenge to hop in and out of NCAA kind of weight certification based structures and then go and have to cut 30 pounds for an international competition and then come back and try to, again, stay within your descent plan and some of those challenges. So with more of that education awareness, I don't know if it would deter them completely, but it presents some major challenges, both from a performance and health perspective of going through that rapid like swing in weight and body fat in those short time frames really puts a lot of stress on the body to be engaged in those different, kind of organizations or affiliations when you're going back and forth there.
And certainly
specifically
6 weight classes at the Olympics doesn't help when you go from 10 at the world level to 6 at the Olympic level. And I know our international federation, our national federations around the world, everybody's trying to appeal to the IOC to say, let's get back to 10 weights per style so that we don't have athletes going into such a severe, because if you're an athlete at that level, you're going to do what you have to do. And especially if there is no minimum enforced, you'll be willing to go to whatever lengths you need to go to be successful, which hopefully if folks that are listening to this podcast are hearing, there's maybe a time and a place for that as you get to that more elite level of competition. But at the youth levels, what are our takeaways from the last amazing 50 minutes of this discussion? What is the recommendation for that youth coach, that youth mom and dad, or the youth athlete who might be listening to this about how they manage their weight, especially at these younger ages, and especially for women?
One message that I usually relay to them is, even going back to Mike's point earlier about muscle mass, is instead of focusing on body fat and fat and things like that, I focus on like good weight, just kind of breaking it down that way for a younger athlete to be able to understand and just say, you want to be as big, as strong as you can, because that means you're more powerful on the mat and likely to be more successful in your sport. So if you're a younger wrestler, get a good strength training program, get a nutrition plan in place so that you can build up your frame as a young wrestler as you continue to grow and develop and settle into a healthy weight, hopefully, but then just being your strongest and most powerful self, so that, again, hopefully that translates to more success on the mat and just being a better wrestler, rather than them worried about cutting weight and being as lean as they can from a body fat and looking in the mirror and just kind of messing with their head and the mental health side of it, like just trying to shift their focus on, again, good weight, being big and strong and powerful, and just kind of shifting the narrative a bit. I just hope we can kind of do that at those younger ages so they don't get caught up into some of the vicious kind of weight cycling and and yo-yo dieting that I know happens sometimes.
Parents and coaches of young athletes should focus on skill growth, acquisition, performance. Weight is not a factor. These children are growing. They're going to get heavier no matter what you do. All you can do is hurt them by having them lose weight when they're young. Do the opposite. Encourage them to get stronger. Encourage them to eat well. Encourage them to be fully hydrated. Encourage them to get quality training. You know, a lot of our athletes compete and don't train. That's not how we get better. We use competition to test our training, but the training is the point. So we need to get that higher level of achievement in the practice room, not the lowest weight. And we frequently recommend people go up a weight class. The opposite of what most, or should say, at least historically, most coaches seem to do, which is go down, go down. No, go up, go up. It's a much better answer.
And I think he hit on it there for my perspective, or our perspective at Indiana Tech. It's that, hey, if I don't have to teach you all of the wrestling because you learned it when you were younger, instead of worrying about cutting weight the whole time, that's going to help. And so let them focus on technique. The results are not the most important thing when you're 8 years old. And I know that's been said a lot more recently, but that is stuff that parents need to know, is that I'm not giving your kid a scholarship based on winning Reno Worlds at 8 years old. That's not what happens. It's the development. It's the opportunities for them to get better at the sport and get healthy, so that when they're with us at the collegiate level and then past that with USA Wrestling, they're not just broken down and hurt all the time. Like that to me is like, we've had athletes that had cut weight for their entire younger life, and then they get to us and they're not as reliable because they're injured more often than the athlete that's been healthy or maybe didn't start wrestling as early and that meant they didn't cut weight like that for their life.
I don't like to really do a lot when it comes to like using fear tactics, but when we talk about concussions and the concussion risk, when your body fat and your hydration are at a lower level, or not body, right, then what are those increased risks? It's great to have somebody from the Mayo Clinic to be able to talk about that too. But concussions are a big issue and an important topic to talk about. How does this weight and hydration, how does that affect that risk?
I think definitely on the hydration side of that, I think it can put them at a higher risk, because you just don't have as much, blood volume circulating throughout your body, and that will also include the brain there. So that's kind of sometimes a cushioning for your brain, is to get that extra fluid and pressure in there that will help prevent some of that kind of concussion-like impact when they're engaged in wrestling stuff. And then also coupling with, anytime you're dehydrated, your cognitive performance, your reaction time, your reactivity, some of those types of characteristics can also go down and make you maybe more susceptible to getting pinned, or, tech falls or some of that kind of stuff that maybe wouldn't have happened or been as likely to happen if you were more alert, more hydrated, and just kind of more focused. And so I think the nutrition or the hydration piece probably has more of an impact than weight alone would. But I think just from the holistic perspective of, like Paul said, if you're constantly cutting weight and in a low energy state, your body is going to suffer as a whole, and the brain could be part of that, but you're just more likely for all kinds of injuries and illnesses and overtraining related symptoms to present themselves if you're constantly in that low energy or energy deficient state.
And think what that does to your grades while you're in school.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
And like you said, the performance too, if our goal is healthy, high performance, to say that we're going to reduce your ability to perform by pulling this weight off, by dehydrating you, we're literally going against what we're saying is our goal. It's just that intentionality of understanding it, hearing it, having open forums where we can talk, having mentors, having great educational programs, and thank goodness having great experts that can come in and share that knowledge with us. Wow, this is, I'm a little tingly right now. Like I feel like what we're sharing here is just so critical as a sport for our future success on both the women's and the men's side. This is awesome. Coach Haggerty, anything we're missing? I know we've got about 5 or 10 minutes to kind of wrap up.
No, I think it's been a great discussion. The one thing that I would ask is, like, if you could frame sort of the process for a young parent that has maybe a young lady starting in the program or a young man and starting in the program with regard to the conversations when we talk about weight classes and things like this. You know, you guys all touched on it to some extent in regards to focusing on the strength and getting stronger, focusing on technique. Are there any other elements that you feel would be important to discuss when it comes to this, when they see their teammates cutting weight or they talk to other parents and things? There, as you guys are we're all connected to this sport in different ways, but there's a lot of misinformation that's out there, and it's being shared across the lines with parents and some coaches, that maybe some of the older coaches, that this is just the way that it's always been. Any messages for these folks?
Yeah, that's hard just because of the pressures that come with the youth sports world. Like I'm living it right now with my two girls, and there's definitely that fear of missing out. You know, if you don't go
Mhm.
all in and sports specialize, and maybe in wrestling terms, it's cutting weight and trying to seek those competitive advantage. It may seem appealing early on, but I can't remember if Cliff or Paul said it. Like no one really gets recruited because of what your record was when you're 8 or 10. It's what do you look like as an 18-year-old? Are you healthy? Have you been performing well? Are you still on your upward trajectory, showing potential for even further, growth and development? I think that's the biggest lesson. And so to some degree, you kind of have to just trust the process and put faith in you're going to be the last one standing when it really matters, not who peaked when they were 8 or 10. And then after that, you battled injuries, maybe had an eating disorder and just really kind of went down the wrong path when you kind of compromised your long-term development as an athlete and cut short what could have been a great longer career or kind of whatever your long-term potential would have been.
I think that it's important for people to know what credible sources of information are. I think that's so important at all levels of this, right? In getting your information from a credible source, and the importance of knowing that you're getting your information from a credible source. You know, my dad makes the joke to me all the time, well, it was on the internet, so it's real. Um, and there unfortunately are people that believe that, right? Like, so knowing the credibility of where you're getting your information, I think is so important. And who is behind the information you're being given. And I think that because education is so powerful, we all know that, and knowledge is so powerful. That's why we're discussing things here today. So knowing where your information is coming from, and is that a credible source for information?
And there's little things that you could implement too as a parent to kind of implement your own little sports science monitoring system, to just maybe do annual assessments on how many push-ups can you do? What's your vertical jump like? What if they go in for their annual physical for sport physicals, like what does, some of those more clinical metrics look like to just make sure things are going in the right direction and they're getting more powerful and their strength, their endurance is going up. Those are things that can kind of give you that feedback of what you're doing is work. They're appropriately developing as an athlete. They're getting stronger. They're getting bigger. They're putting on muscle. Those are all good signs that, again, they're going in the right direction. Whereas if they lose strength, throughout their adolescent years or, kind of start reverting backwards, that should be a warning sign that, hey, something's wrong here. They're not really developing as they should. Maybe they're under eating or overtraining or a mixture of the two. And so there's some, fairly reasonable things that you could implement as a parent or some of the younger coaches too at that level to just kind of implement a monitoring system to screen out any of those red flags if someone's not adapting appropriately.
And I'd like to stress that winning and losing has nothing to do with this. You
Mhm.
can wrestle a bunch of nobodies and win. You can wrestle a bunch of great wrestlers and lose. It has nothing to do with your personal growth and development. You know, you can't control wins and losses, but you can control how hard you train, what effort you put in. If you're eating properly, multiple times per day, we're not starving ourselves to make weight. We're not dehydrating. We're getting our, whatever's appropriate for our age, for water intake for that day. Those are the wins, right? If a parent wants to track how much water their child is drinking during season, I think that's a fine way to go. If they're only drinking one bottle of water all day, that's probably not good. We're drinking 5, 6, 7 bottles of water. Hey, we're in a much better place now. Those are the types of things that we should be looking at developing youth athletes so that they have a future rather than burn out by the age of 12 and quit.
Hmm.
We'd had an athlete at one of my colleges and was struggling, an hour into practice was just energy was gone and it was probably the best, it was hands down the best wrestler in the room. And I got to a point where I just said, hey, I want you to drink a gallon of water every day. And he looked at me, he goes, I'll never make weight. And I said, then that's on me. But you start now drinking a gallon of water every day. And then on the day before we start to get to weigh in, then we can scale back a little bit. But you don't need to be dehydrated for 6-7 days in order to compete for one day. You can keep your body weight with hydration up a little higher because then it will come off. And without that knowledge of how much is going in, it's really hard as a coach to make a good decision about how much you can take out. And as soon as that athlete started drinking the water, performance went up, motivation went up, school went up, everything changed for the better. And I wasn't always the person who lived that example myself as an athlete because I often gave into those other pressures, whether they were justified. I mean, I guess you can always justify it. So.
But yeah, we preach all the time, eat and drink to work harder to make weight. Starving, dehydrating is the lazy way out. It's the weak way out. It's not going to get you where you want to go.
Right. Low performance.
Very low performance. And with women, it's even worse than with men. Right. Sure. I saw a study recently that with women, if they dehydrate for 24 hours, they can lose up to 45% of their performance. Wow. 45%, no one's going to succeed doing that.
No.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's just, again, more of the education, just as we're discussing here, just needs to trickle down to the younger age levels and make sure they're getting information from these sources and not, what their parents may have done 40 years ago as a wrestler, or some of those kind of more older school tactics that hopefully are being phased out.
Well, and think of how far exercise science has come in 40 years too. We didn't know anything back then. And then on the women's side, it's only been 15 or 20 years we've been looking at female athletes. So, if you really want to be good about it, go and start reading the books and reading the research and, keeping up with what we know today versus what we thought we knew way back when we didn't know anything.
I always say I don't want a heart surgeon that is using techniques from 40 years ago. I want a heart surgeon using techniques from today. The same could be true for any of our coaches in our sports. And so this is awesome. Lost your hearing.
Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, sorry about that. Hey, AJ, you mentioned this earlier, and I think it's really powerful, is that most of the time, information from the science community doesn't move into practical application that fast. And here's an example of where it really did move pretty quickly. Is there a way that this model could be adapted for other things in the wrestling community to take these kind of issues that are science-based that we can really utilize, whether it's USA Wrestling, the NCAA? This seems to me to be a bit of an outlier that we were able to move this quickly with something that is really that important when we're talking about the health of athletes, et cetera. This tracked pretty fast. Kudos to everyone involved in the process, but it does seem to me that this is a pretty exciting model if we could do more things in this area in our sport of wrestling in particular.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think wrestling's a bit behind in terms of all the kind of combat sports and the type of research that has gone on. Even me personally, a lot of stuff that I use for weight management stuff with our local team, I've kind of pulled from what the UFC Performance Institute has done. There's a lot of international studies that have done some good stuff with weight loss and nutritional modifiers to kind of manage the weight cutting process, but it's coming from Europe and some of those other kind of combat sports where, again, their weigh-in process is different than how it's done in the States for wrestling. So it has to be taken with a little bit of grain of salt, but that's kind of the best we have currently is to provide some of those evidence-based guidelines. Is kind of stealing from some other combat sports and adapting it to the sport of wrestling. Whereas if we could do wrestling-centric research, I would love to kind of get more involved with that so that we can kind of translate it right back into the sport itself. And maybe in a future episode, we can have Dave Malachek, our local wrestling coach here, because he's put up with us doing a lot of sports science related projects over the last few years. But I'm confident that he would say it's been for the better. And his team has learned so much on proper nutrition and fluid intake and training practices and kind of self-monitoring throughout the season to make sure everyone's adapting well. And their team has finished incrementally better the last 3 or 4 years that we've kind of been involved with them. And so I think he would be a testament to seeking out, evidence-based practices and guidelines, and kind of would provide the coach's perspective on how it's, directly helped his program, and hopefully others would kind of follow suit with it, some of that too.
This is awesome. I feel so much, almost like a recharged energy and positivity about our sport, just hearing what's going on behind the scenes. And I don't know if that was our intention, but it's certainly an amazing byproduct of bringing great people together. So thank you all. Any last words or last thoughts before we kind of close the episode?
Just
No?
appreciate you wanting to get some education out there around the topic, around the women's sport, and especially around the safety of the student athlete.
It's our honor to have great folks and great leaders, and wow, just I'm done. I don't have any more words. This has been such a good hour. Coach Haggerty, any final words?
No, I appreciate you guys jumping on with us. This has been one of the best times that, just educational, just tons of information. I hope that our coaches and, other folks, parents that dial into this can extract some of this information and use it in a productive and positive way. So thanks again, guys.
Yeah. Thanks to everybody, thanks to all of our listeners and viewers out there, from all of us at USA Wrestling, National Wrestling Coaches Council, from the National Wrestling Coaches Association, from the Mayo Clinic, and our leadership at both the NAIA and NCAA level programs, and our tremendous guest panel today. Thank you so much. We look forward to tuning in next time. Take care.